So in chapter 5, Locke deals with property. As I said at the end of the last session, property has been a sort of a non-issue before this. The assumption is that property is the creation of whatever the government or whatever the society wants to do. And remember, before Locke, there is no separation between government and society. So we don't have any split there, but Locke splits them. And so where does property fall, right, on the two sides of this division? Is it part of government? Is it part of society? Because if it's part of society, then it's natural in a different way than government is natural. Government is natural because we humans figured out that this is what we needed to do in order to keep from killing each other. Property is natural in a different way. So let's look at what Locke does to come up with that, right? And we begin with the problem, and this is a familiar problem, which is usually solved by sort of the arrangement of the sovereign power, whatever the sovereign power is, and that is, God gave the world to humans in common. So how does anything that is given in common become private, right? And moreover, Locke is the great philosopher of consent, or compact, or agreement, right? So at the end of section 25, he asks this question, right? Or he makes this claim, right? I shall endeavor to show how men might come to have a property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact of the commoners. So how does something become your personal property when nobody else has agreed to that? God didn't give it to you. Nature certainly didn't give it to you. So where does it come from? How does it get to be that? So this is an interesting problem, right? And it's a special problem for Locke, as I said, because he's separating society and state. So all of this, remember, is happening before there is government. So this is civil society or society, not the state, okay? So how do you get there? Well, Locke says, how do you understand what is of use to somebody, right? So the fruits it produces, etc. I mean, the earth produces abundantly, and how does that get separated out? So there must be a means to appropriate the things of the earth to an individual that don't depend on someone's gift. And in section 27, he tells us how, right? Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. Okay, so you have a property in your person. Nobody else has any right to the power, to the work of your body. And the word that Locke uses for work is labor. He misspells it, but that's a different problem. You know, that's a British thing. So labor, right? This is the great breakthrough in modern political thought. The idea that labor is the key to property. And this is not something really that gets disputed much. I mean, nobody really challenges Locke on property rights. Even Marx, right, does not challenge Locke on property rights. In fact, Marx says that Locke is perfectly right. And the problem is that the labor of the laboring classes is being stolen by the capitalist classes, the bourgeois classes. So this idea of labor is an insight that Locke has, that later writers do draw on. And mind you, this is something that makes slavery a problem, because if your labor is your labor, then what right does anybody else have to hold you in slavery? You have to answer that question, right? Where does that come from? And again, that's a problem. So whatever he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined it to something that it is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So you are walking out in the woods because you're naked and cold and it's fall, and this is before society, before civilization, and you see an acorn on the ground, and you're hungry because this is before society or before government, and you're perpetually hungry. So you pick up the acorn and you eat it. That makes it your acorn. Whatever you mix your labor with. And so this is, as he says at the end of 27, right? The unquestionable property of the laborer. So you have property in your own body. You have rights to your own labor. And that includes mental labor as well as physical working, physical labor. But he qualifies it, right? At least where there is enough and is good left for others. And this is going to be important for Locke, because how do you decide what the limits of property acquisition are? And we'll see that he has an answer to that. So Locke's solution to this problem is elegant, right? He elaborates a little bit in section 28, right? It is plain, bottom of the first column on 719, it is plain if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could, right? What else could make something yours, right? Now, you can object at some level, right? Is possession really 9 points of the law, as they say? Well, that again depends on if you steal the ball from your sibling, right? That depends on a prior relationship that the labor really doesn't count in. So that's a different kind of problem, right? But when Locke is talking about labor, he really does mean it in this sense, So, and he goes on in 28, right? The taking of this or that part does not depend on the express consent of all the commoners. Imagine if it did, right? You'd have to, if you're going to put your horse out to pasture, and you're going to have to bargain with people for the right of the horse to eat the grass. So this is not something that is much of a concern to Locke. As long as there is stuff left over, the labor that was mine, he concludes, right? The labor that was mine, removing them out of that common state they were in, hath fixed my property in them. So this is a big deal. And he goes on to explain, why we don't insist on unanimous consent. And again, though, for Locke, right, this is something perfectly natural. Your labor is natural to you. My labor is natural to me. And so any property acquisition then that we do is owned, is property by nature. And that's a critical thing, right? So labor gives the value of things. And again, remember, go back to what Hobbes had said when he talks about, oh, I don't have that quote, but when he talks about reason is attained by industry, right? So when Hobbes is talking about that, he's really saying a very similar thing, right? That it's human labor that makes the difference. It's human labor that makes possible the other acquisitions that human beings make. So this is a powerful concept, and it drives a whole lot of stuff then for Locke. Because for Locke, then, what is a natural right, right? Well, property has got to be a natural right because of the way he defines what property is. And so if government's job is to protect natural rights, then it has to be government's job to protect property too. And so this is how we get, well, this is where we get libertarians and that sort of thing. Right? So in section 31, right, nature bounds the property. Right? The same law of nature that does by this means give us property does also bound that property too. First column on 720. What is that limit, right? Well, the limit is, he says, to enjoy. As much as anyone can make use of to advantage, as much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much may he by labor fix his property in. Okay? And as it goes on to say, well, further on, right? The bound is, don't let something decay in your, as you are holding it, and rot away, right? If something perishes in your possession and is not used, that's a problem. And that's a limit. You've owned too much if you do that. So what about land, right? Well, land, as much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. Notice that what he's talking about here is primarily, except for land, but primarily perishable stuff, right? Foodstuffs or clothes or things like that, things that haven't got a terribly long shelf life. We're going to get to money in a minute. But in the meantime, right, Locke goes on to refine this idea of labor. So sections 34, and then 35 and 36, right? The world, God authorizes this, which is important for Locke. God authorizes this because although he gave the world to men in common, he also gave us property in our bodies. He gave us the labor of our bodies and encouraged us to use it to, as he said to Adam, right, go forth and subdue the earth. God gave it to the industrious and rational, right? Not, he says, to the fancy or covetousness of the quarrelsome and contentious. That's in section 34. So God's gift is a gift to labor. And that's what he commanded us to do, right? So 36, the measure of property nature has well set by the extent of men's labor and the conveniences of life. So it was impossible for any man to entrench upon the rights of another, or to acquire to himself a property to the prejudice of his neighbor, right? Because you can only do so much, you can only perform so much labor. And especially in the beginning ages of the world, nobody had enough labor to subdue vast quantities of land. But at the end of 36, then we get to the key problem, right? The thing that confuses everybody, and Locke says this is tremendous confusion. And that is money, right? So the world, there is land enough in the world to suffice double the inhabitants, had not the invention of money and the tacit agreement of men to put a value on it, introduced by consent, larger possessions and a right to them, which how it has done, I shall by and by show more large. So money is something that humans have agreed on, and they've agreed to accept a price, a piece of gold, that's valued in a certain way, and so forth and so on. They've learned to accept something that is permanent, that is undecaying, in place of decaying things. And Locke says this is an improvement, right? So the invention of money, again, is a technology. It's like government. It's a technology that we use to escape from the constraints that that nature has imposed on us. And so we do the mental labor of inventing money. We make a compact to agree on it. Remember, we're still in the state of nature. And that overcomes the natural problem of limits to acquisition. In the same way the government overcomes the natural problem of humans being dangerous to one another. So, and there we go, section 37, 721, second column, right? It is certain that in the beginning, before the desire of having more than man needed had altered the intrinsic value of things, which depends only on their usefulness to the life of man, or had agreed that a little piece of yellow metal, which would keep without wasting or decay, should be worth a great piece of flesh or a whole heap of corn. So, again, we figured it out. We overcame the limits that God had imposed. In that sense, I mean, from Locke's point of view, God gave us permission to do that, okay? But at the same time, that in some way makes us better than God, which is kind of nice. Well, I don't know. You can feel good about yourself if you want. So, and then he talks about decay, and then in section 40, right? Nor is it strange. Nor is it strange, as perhaps before consideration it may appear, that the property of labor should be able to overbalance the community of land. For it is labor indeed that puts the difference of value on everything. Right? Labor is the key to value. Labor is what we put in to the effort. Labor is what we give to the effort to, or to the process of giving value to things. And labor is more valuable to us than nature, it turns out, right? Because he says in that paragraph, I think it will be but a very modest computation to say that of the products of the earth useful to the life of man, 9/10 are the effects of labor. And he goes on to actually make that 99/100 later on. So nature is blank. Nature is without value, right? Until we put a value on things. Oh, he says that later in the same paragraph, right? We shall find that in most of them, 99/100 are wholly to be put on the account of labor. That's extremely valuable. That's extraordinarily valuable. And you see what that does, right? That elevates human labor well above the gifts of God, well above the things of nature, right? And so when it comes to the invention of government, which he's going to get to in a couple of chapters here, when he gets to the invention of government, understand that this is an extraordinary power that human beings have. In 42, Locke draws out section 42. This is on 723 in the first column. In section 42, he draws out exactly what the implications of this are for government. And again, remember, I talked last time a little bit about, or when I talked about Hobbes, I talked about the ways that England had financed its wars in the 17th and 18th centuries, or sorry, 16th and 17th centuries. And the degree to which that made England, by the time Locke is writing, this makes England a very wealthy country indeed. And in another century, it's going to be the wealthiest country in the world. Why? Again, not because it's accumulated a whole bunch of silver and gold and is sitting on them. Locke understands that the important thing is the dynamism, right? Is the work product. So look what he says in that first column on 723, section 42, in the second paragraph. This shows how much numbers of men are to be preferred to largeness of dominions, and that the increase of lands and the right of employing of them is the great art of government. In other words, directing the labor of the community is the key to wealth, right? Not having lands, but having the labor, having the numbers of men who are able to put in the labor, put in the rational thought to securing the various ends which we're trying to secure, right? So if you understand labor as the source of value, then you understand the importance in the modern economy, right? So in 43, he elaborates on that, right? It is labor, bottom of first column, top of second, and 723. It is labor then which puts the greatest part of the value upon land, without which it would scarce be worth anything, right? What would land be without the human labor that goes into cultivating it, or beautifying it, or building a house on it, or whatever it is that increases the value? Nature and the earth, a little further down on 723. Nature and the earth furnished only the almost worthless materials as in themselves, right? So it went from 9/10 to 99/100 to almost worthless in the span of less than a page, just about a page. So property comes from labor. Labor, property, and therefore the fruits of labor, is the thing that government exists to secure and defend. So, so at the end of 46, right, 46, he makes that the same point, right? The greatest part of things really useful to the life of man, food, clothing, shelter, etc., are generally things of short duration, right? I mean, meat only survives so long, even in the freezer, and Locke didn't have a freezer. But metal, but agreement, rational agreement, logical, agreement that we have agreed. Let me try that again. Agreement that we have conceived mentally, agreement that we have worked with others to achieve, right? On a money, something that amounts to money, right? That is the thing that makes the difference between natural scarcity and abundance. And so if you want to have a polity that is abundant, then you have to preserve, you have to protect, you have to defend, why not preserve, protect, and defend this natural right to labor, right? And you have to take care of that. You have to use it in the right way. And that, he says, is the great art of government. He emphasizes the fact at the end of 50, he emphasizes the fact that this is not done in civil society. This is done in nature, right? This partage of things in an inequality of private possessions, men have made practicable out of the bounds of society and without compact only by putting a value on gold and silver and tacitly agreeing in the use of money. So the state of nature, right? Hobbes says it's a state of war. Locke says, no, look, all of these things are happening outside of society, happening in the state of nature. And to the extent that it's a state of peace, a state of prosperity, it is a state where we can have these things and we can agree with each other on things. So, and we're going to see when we start on chapter 6, we're going to see exactly, this is sort of the last stage of natural society and the beginning of civil society. So the last piece, right? Your person, your property, and your family. Those are the three things that occur outside of civil society and in the state of nature. So next time we'll talk about the family. Thanks.